In this episode, we look at the costumes of Sleepy Hollow. Coming up. Welcome back to another episode of Costume Co. If you're new to the channel, I make almost weekly videos analyzing movies and TV shows from a costume perspective. If this is something that interests you, consider subscribing so you won't miss any of my upcoming videos. In this episode, I analyze the costumes of Sleepy Hollow, a 1999 American Gothic supernatural horror film directed by Tim Burton and starring Johnny Depp and Christina Ricci. Let's get right to it. Despite this being an almost 20-year-old movie, I still need to warn you of spoilers. Sleepy Hollow is based on the Washington Irving short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Director Tim Burton styled Sleepy Hollow after the horror films of the 50s and 60s, even encouraging his production team to watch films like Mario Bava's Black Sunday, Roman Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Killers, and other Hammer horror films. He said, "They're beautiful, those movies. They really have an art to them, and those are my favorite kind of movies." According to the production notes on the movie's 1799 setting, the film's fairy tale-like images are enhanced through DOP, Emmanuel Lubezki's highly stylized lighting, and a tightly controlled color palette that permeates everything from set design to costumes. Lubezki said, "We wanted an almost black and white feel, very monochromatic with lots of contrast. The wardrobe provides accents of color." Critically acclaimed costume designer Colleen Atwood has 12 Academy Award nominations for Best Costume Design, with a total of 4 wins under her belt. Sleepy Hollow marked her 4th collaboration with director Tim Burton. Atwood, who has gone on to design movies like Alice in Wonderland, again with Burton, Snow White and the Huntsman, and Fantastic Beasts, looks back at Sleepy Hollow, now almost 20 years old, with some nostalgia. She said, "I had such a nice time making all of those costumes. I did a lot of painting and things I hadn't done before while costuming for that movie." For Sleepy Hollow, Atwood's research focused on period paintings and visual descriptions of costumes from books. Atwood said, "There were no existing photographs, but since this film is not a history lesson, the work becomes very impressionistic." The production notes state that, to shoot the elaborate New York City street scenes, the filmmakers took over 2 square blocks near London's historic Somerset House. The scene involved period vehicles, props, and hundreds of extras, all elegantly styled by costume designer Colleen Atwood. Production designer Rick Heinrich said, "Our set was just a backdrop for Colleen's beautiful clothes." In the film's opening scene, Depp wears a constable's uniform, which Atwood describes as incredibly chic. "Uniforms of the period were beautifully made," she said. "They weren't the polyester we have today." But according to IMDb, the New York Police Department, of which Ichabod Crane is a constable, was not founded until 1844, and the dark blue uniform was not issued until 1853. Here's an illustration of the New York City Police Department uniform, which is fashioned after London's Metropolitan Police Service's navy blue uniform that came into effect in 1854. While police wore a badge, they were not required to wear a regulation uniform before this time. The production notes state, once Ichabod travels to Sleepy Hollow, he essentially wears one costume in varying stages: a long black waistcoat with hand-sewn gold trimming and a hand-painted silk lining that kicks back light when he moves. Atwood explains that people didn't have a lot of clothing unless they were incredibly wealthy. The idea with Ichabod's costume was to make it very minimal, sleek and long in feeling, a sort of shadowy feeling of his character. According to IMDb, Johnny Depp offered to add prosthetics to his face to make himself look ugly, but director Tim Burton wanted to base the character on Crane's more unattractive personality traits, his reported squeamishness and eccentricity. Now, it's likely that multiple costumes were required because of the various blood splatter effects and overall dirty conditions on the Sleepy Hollow set. And a fun fact is that this movie was almost entirely shot with a blue filter, so for the blood to appear red, the liquid used had to be bright orange. Again, according to IMDb, Johnny Depp did all of his own stunts for the final scene where he is dragged by the horse. He had bulletproof clothing underneath his wardrobe. Now, as a reference, here's an example of a man's silk and linen three-piece ensemble from the Met. This suit is French in origin, and it dates from about 1790. And like Ichabod Crane, this ensemble features a stand-up collar on both the waistcoat and the coat. Here's another example. This is an American velvet frock coat and waistcoat, and it's from a collection at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It dates between 1775 to 1800. Here is a still of actor Johnny Depp in his costume, and then pictured on the right is from an exhibit. And a nice detail is the green toppers on his otherwise black riding boots. Here's an example of some French early 19th century leather presentation riding boots from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Ichabod Crane has one minor change in this scene when he's performing an autopsy. So he removes his jacket and dons this canvas apron, again with loads of blood splatter. In this scene, you can see the beautiful pleats on his poet shirt and also a close-up of his signet ring. The more elaborate costumes were worn by the villagers of Sleepy Hollow, each one intricately crafted by Atwood and her team from specially chosen fabrics. Atwood said of this, "They're sort of like country folk that are 5 or 6 years behind the minute, but with the maximum amount of trim and gear to show their money on the outside." Atwood has established each character by way of their costumes, and hair and makeup has helped in this regards as well, in a way to convey their occupation and station within the village. According to IMDb, the costumes worn by Katrina and Lady Van Tassel were from an earlier decade, circa 1785. Colleen Atwood wanted the costumes to reflect the period 1794, despite the setting of 1799. But by 1794, women's dresses reflected the beginning of the Regency period, closer to the body with a higher waist and much less elaborate than those displayed in the film. Unlike Ichabod Crane and some of the townsfolk, this Sleepy Hollow ingenue has multiple costume changes. Her father, Baltus Van Tassel, is the wealthiest man in Sleepy Hollow, and she dresses the part of his only daughter and heir. Colleen Atwood stated that at the time, actor Christina Ricci had the perfect body for period costumes because she is tiny yet curvaceous. Here's the two-piece gown on display. So after production was closed, many of the Sleepy Hollow costumes like this one were sold through an online auction. And this is sometimes done as a way to recoup some money, but I think that it's a bit unfortunate because audiences often want to see the costumes and props from their favorite movies, which is why we are seeing more TV and movie studios holding on to their collections. In these two late 18th century neoclassical paintings on display from the Met, we see examples of a tucker featured along the neckline of the bodice. So, according to the Age of Antiquity historical costuming blog, it states a tucker is a ruffle or either lace or fine material, cotton mull or silk gauze that is ruffled into a tape and then sewn to the inside of a gown's neckline so that it shows on the outside. Through most of the 18th century, tuckers were relatively narrow and stuck straight up, partially filling in the low neckline. And you can see the tucker featured on many of Katrina's bodices. This type of bodice she's wearing here closely resembles a French caraco, meaning camisole. And here's an example of a late 18th century skirt and matching caraco from the Fashion Museum of the city of Paris. This type of jacket is sometimes referred to as a pierrot, a French word for sparrow. So the pierrot jacket, like this one from the Kyoto Costume Institute collection, it's a short-fitted jacket with short tails, which is probably why it's referred to as a sparrow. And it was popular from the mid-1780s through to the 1790s. Now, this muted blue velvet striped bodice with a center front closure is matched beautifully with this pleated taffeta skirt. So the bodice has a wide open neckline, which is trimmed with a gently gathered tucker, again, and it's fastened at the center front, most likely with hooks and eyes. The delicate paneled apron on the front of the skirt, it was actually a popular fashion item in the late 1700s. This type of gown, as seen in this painted portrait on display at the Palace of Versailles, was made popular in France by Queen Marie Antoinette. The berger gown, or shepherdess gown as it was called, was directly inspired by the attire worn by country women. Here's the costume looking much worse for wear before it was sold through an online auction. So what happens is after production has wrapped, the costume was likely hastily bagged up, and then through this process, the taffeta skirt and apron were crushed and bruised. And, without the original foundation garments that give the costumes their structure and shape, it loses some of its Hollywood magic. And there's also a good deal of breakdown on the hem, something that I hold in very high regard in historical productions, as you probably know. Here's a close-up detail of both the lovely embroidery on the linen apron, which again you can see is really crushed, and the dyed machine embroidered boots on the right. This frock sort of blends into the masonry of the chimney and the misty landscape of Sleepy Hollow. So the gown looks a bit like a riding habit with the overskirt drawn up at the back. Here's a good look at the fullness of the skirt. Now this style of costume is called a robe à l'anglaise, or English gown. According to the Palace of Versailles, where the portrait on the left is on display, it was characterized by the rejection of panniers, which were replaced by a frame that was padded using horsehair. And this type of gown was inspired by the redingote worn by men during the same period. This redingote gown was fairly versatile, always close-fitting at the waist. It was often worn open at the front, but also could close using large metal buttons. Here's the costume from the online auction house again before it was sold, without the foundation garments that give the skirt its fullness. And the skirts of the overgown are drawn up in a polonaise with the help of cords and then looped onto buttons at the waist. One of the most striking costumes is this stunning soft green hooded cloak with a red rose motif on the silk lining. It appears to be made of pan velvet or a very low pile fur and then lined with silk or matte satin. The striking feature are those red rose embellishments, and I don't have a better close-up, so it's difficult to tell whether they are hand-painted or embroidered or even both. It might possibly be appliques because depending on the frame at times they appear to be three-dimensional. This is what Katrina is wearing underneath the cloak. The bodice is again that sort of berger gown because I haven't seen anything else like this late in the century. Now, some aspects of the silhouette, like the cuffs of the sleeves, even harken back to the mid-18th century. This black and white striped gown is called a robe à la polonaise. According to the Met Museum, it was a style of gown with a close-fitting bodice and the back of the skirt gathered up into 3 separate puff sections to reveal the petticoat below. Most often the dress had rows of little rings sewn inside the skirt, like with this costume, through which a cord ran from hem to waist. However, in some instances, the skirt was held in place by a simple cord sewn to the inner waist of a dress and looped over buttons attached to the outside waistline, like we saw on her previous costume. Here's a stunning example of a woman's gown with a similar likeness dating 1785 to 1790. This gown is cut in the English way without a sack back, and this twill dress is of French origin from a collection at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Here's an example of a rose à la polonaise from the Met. This French silk gown dates about 1780. You might have noticed that the dress worn has the same pattern as Michael Keaton's outfit in Beetlejuice from 1988, also directed by Tim Burton. One of my favorite costumes of the villagers is the midwife Beth Killian, dressed in a hand-embroidered linen bodice and skirt with a beautiful bobbin lace tucker. The collar, cuffs, and hem are also trimmed with the pretty scalloped lace. The bodice features this exaggerated conical shape that drops deeply in the front but is softened by these pretty flounces at the side waist. And then the bodice is closed at the front with these crochet lace-covered buttons. Here's the costume on display before it was sold to a private collector. So I was happy to learn that the costume was sold to a costume blogger who analyzed the costume in depth on her website. So while it looks as though there is a built-in crinoline, the costume lacks the stays and bum roll that give a costume like this its silhouette. Next to Katrina, Lady Mary Van Tassel has some of the most stunning costumes in Sleepy Hollow. Now, according to Atwood, the most extravagant dresses belong to Lady Van Tassel, played by Miranda Richardson. She said, "She's definitely ruling the roost. When a character aspires to something greater than what they've had, they take it to a whole different level." This gown's a complicated bit of business. The dress is made from this sunny yellow silk jacquard with this sheer net overlay featuring this black swirled detail. So it appears that the swirls are created with strips of black taffeta that were pleated or ruched on both sides and then tacked down into position. This is a commonly used decorative technique done on women's 18th and 19th century gowns. Here's an example of the ruching technique taken from the Antique Sewist blog. Its purpose is twofold. Firstly, it creates a beautifully decorative trim, while at the same time the gathers or the pleats make it easier for the trim to go around curves like we see here. So I'll leave a link to her blog because she has some amazing step-by-step images. Now, this English-style taffeta gown would typically be fastened with pins at the front, but instead it appears that the stomacher is split and closed at the center front with hooks and eyes. Here's an example of a silken metal robe à l'anglaise. Now, according to the Met, where this beauty is on display, the robe à l'anglaise developed with a fitted back after the style of dress worn in England. The silhouette composed of a funnel-shaped bust feeding into wide rectangular skirts, which were often open at the front to expose a highly decorated underskirt. During this scene, Lady Mary has removed her overgown, revealing this stunning set of stays underneath. The bone channels here are embellished with this pretty embroidery stitch. Now, I've mentioned in other videos that a linen shift would always be worn under the stays, but for the purpose of this scene, and perhaps to give the character a more seductive look, the shift was omitted. Here's an example of a set of stays from a slightly earlier time period. These silk-covered stays of Italian origin are from the 1770s. And according to Met, whalebone was replaced by steel boning, which only increased the strength of corsets and aided the ability to draw in the laces even tighter. In this less formal scene, Lady Mary dons a caraco, which is a long-length jacket with a fitted back. Here's another example of a caraco from the Fashion Museum of the city of Paris. This style of jacket was often worn with a petticoat and open in the front with a stomacher or decorative stays. And the sleeves were either full length or 3/4 length, but were always tightly fitted. Here's the costume on display from the online auction house. So the jacket and skirt, they're both made from an embroidered silk taffeta. And then there's a floral mesh overlay on part of the jacket and skirt. And then some of the floral motif has been cut out of the overlay and applied directly onto the center front opening and hem of the caraco jacket. We only get a brief glimpse at this royal blue velvet gown. It has a bit of a Renaissance feel to it, I think, though. And one of Lady Mary's best costumes, of course, is this brocade gown with a contrasting yellow stand-up collar and stomacher. And again, there's a little bit of a Renaissance influence with the black lace partlet. The collar and cuffs are trimmed with these embroidered daisy circles. Here's the complete costume on the left, featuring this really unusual apron that's made from the same embroidered daisy circles. And then on the right, how it looked in Sleepy Hollow. And you can really see how the petticoat and panniers fill out the underskirts and polonaise. And you might also notice that the yellow stomacher is positioned incorrectly on the display. It should actually be directly under the laces. And here's the costume on another display, again from the online auction house, but without the underskirt and apron. And in the center image, you can see that the daisy circles are used to hold up the polonaise. Colleen Atwood stated that costume-wise, the biggest challenge for her was the black and white dress worn by Miranda Richardson when she goes into the Tree of the Dead, and I got the inspiration for it from a painting, she says. In the end, I made it my tribute to Adrienne's black and white ball scene in the 1939 vintage film Marie Antoinette. And here's the dress I think that Atwood is referring to, although I think the pattern looks more like her bumblebee yellow dress we first see her in. Atwood said it was such a challenge to create, and the way Miranda Richardson wore the costume was fantastic. The original inspiration was that it reminded me of Bark in the Forest. I wanted it to fit in the woods, but still be very grand and of her own world. Miranda really understood what the architecture of the dress was, that it went from light to dark. When she walked in it, she walked straight forward and then turned to the side so you got the play of light on the costume. These are likely the paintings that inspired the architectural aspects of the dress. So the painting on the left by English artist Sir Edward Coley Burne-Jones is a portrait of a fictional character named Sidonia von Bork, who is the central figure in Willem Meinhold's Gothic romance Sidonia the Sorceress. The novel is set in 16th century Pomerania and chronicles the crimes of the evil Sidonia, whose beauty captivates all who see her. Now, according to the Tate Gallery where the painting is displayed, the costume is actually derived from the Isabella d'Este portrait seen on the right, and it's part of the Royal Collection in Windsor. And no Sleepy Hollow story would be complete without its Headless Horseman. According to IMDb, this is the first adaptation of the legend of Sleepy Hollow that doesn't involve the actor playing the Headless Horseman having to conceal his head in the cloak. The head of the actor was covered with a blue mask that was deleted by means of computer graphics. The collar was also created with CGI to match the flow of the robe. And to give actor Christopher Walken a supernatural look, he wore false teeth and ice blue contact lenses. Now, I don't have information on the building in this costume, but it looks like the doublet, which is seen in the middle, is made of leather with an embossed leather plastron added on that features these mirroring fiery dragons. And the cloak, I think, is brocade, although it looks like it has been stiffened, and then it's lined with a dark red taffeta. And then finally, the entire costume is heavily broken down. In this shot, we can see the thigh-high side-lace boots made of leather with a red backing and featuring spurs, and then gauntlets that feature some type of battle axe. And finally, the cloak, which is in the picture on the right, appears heavily distressed, but it must be quite heavy because it's worn on the body with leather straps. And if you like Gothic stories and historical costumes, be sure to check out my video on the costumes of Crimson Peak. As always, thank you so much for watching.